good morning and welcome to this Centre for Policy Studies webinar, Where Are the Workers? Well, that's right, we're going to be talking economic inactivity today, about those people who are neither in work nor looking for work. Now, since the onset of the pandemic, every developed country in the world has seen a massive upsurge in economic inactivity. So the UK is not an outlier there, but unlike everywhere else, we still have elevated levels of inactivity. In fact, we have 500,000 people who were formerly in work and who are no longer in work. So today we're going to be exploring questions around who are these people? Where have they gone? Why have they left the labour market? Can we get them back? Will that move the dial on economic growth in the coming months and years? Who should we be prioritising? Should we be looking at the young, the old, male, female, the unwell, the affluent, a bit of everything? And we'll also be thinking about what we expect or hope to see in the Chancellor's statement next week. So to discuss these questions today, we have four really fantastic panelists here, and I will introduce them momentarily. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. So the format for today, we will begin with opening remarks from each of the panelists in return. Then we'll have a general discussion, and finally, questions from the audience. But I would urge anyone watching, whether that's on Zoom, YouTube, Twitter, or any other platform, to submit questions as you go along, and they will be collated by my colleagues and fed to me. And then hopefully we can get some answers to your burning questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, introductions. So first up, we will have Right Honourable Chloe Smith, the Member of Parliament for Norwich North, former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and before that, Minister for Disabled People, Health and Work. Then we want to have Julian Jessup, Fellow at the IEA, distinguished economist with a long and extensive record of writing about the British economy, and avid CPS followers might recognise him as a regular contributor to CAPEC, our media arm. I would say always read his articles, always very informative. Then we'll have Henry Kerr, who is the economics editor at The Economist, who has written prolifically on the British economy over the last few years, sorry. And then finally, we'll have opening remarks from Jonathan Cribb, who is Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and the Director of their Pensions Review, which is looking at the future of the pension systems and financial security in retirement. So on that note, could I ask you to kick us off, Chloe, please?
Good morning, Carl, and good morning, everybody. It's really great to join you for this event. And I think this event is looking at an absolutely essential topic. I expect quite a few of our comments today will focus around the budget. We might situate ourselves in relation to announcements expected next Wednesday. But of course, actually what we've got here is an urgent, but also long-term issue. So the budget is one step in that road, but is not the be-all and end-all. I'm actually very excited, though, that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister are taking this issue seriously. I think that's exactly right. I think this is a real imperative for action, and I'll explain why. And it's something that I began focusing on as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions last year. So I'm absolutely delighted to see others now picking up that ball, running with it, and I want them to make a real difference. And what I think that they need to make a difference to is twofold. It's helping British businesses to grow and British people to succeed. You can do both if you crack this issue of economic inactivity and help more people into jobs. We are not short of jobs. 3/4 of UK companies struggle with labour shortages. We're not alone in that internationally. So with over 1 million job vacancies, employers have to find talent in new places, and they should be open to the nearly 9 million who have not recently looked for work, which is what we call economically inactive in the jargon. Now, this is more than 1 in 5 people of working age. It includes people who have retired early, are long-term sick or disabled, or have caring responsibilities. It also includes students, although I personally think that is a less pressing part of this case, so I won't focus on them in my remarks today. Now, 1.7 million of the 9 million say that they want a job. And if businesses don't match those people with their 1.1 million vacancies, then the country is stunted and too many people are being wrongly written off. Now, of course, the Chancellor is absolutely right to look at why fewer Brits are participating in the economy. Taxes have to stretch to benefits if a person isn't in work. I also think that immigration is not the solution to this problem. If billions of pounds are spent in failing to get British workers fit for where their talents can take them. And I also think it's the case that every unfilled vacancy now is a missed opportunity for a person to gain skills and experience. So the cost of having millions of people who are not in work but could be in work is very expensive, billions of pounds, but it's an appalling waste of opportunity as well. And the human price within this of, for example, 2.5 million people out of work with long-term sickness is a real tragedy. We should be moving heaven and earth to treat them and help them to be well. Now, I think the NHS could do more here. Jeremy Hunt correctly prescribes that the NHS must help people into work. So I think we need to be looking for ways, and I'm sure he will be doing this at the budget next week, for the NHS to link up better with work. The Federation of Small Businesses makes some very sound arguments around this. For example, simple things like getting GPs guidelines to link to managing at work. Now, obviously, there is also a point here about needing to continue to do the work to bust the NHS backlogs. We could debate whether we ought to be getting quicker treatment to those who have a chance of being in work. Businesses have a key role to play here as well. Business ought to be investing in occupational health to help people stay and stay healthily in the workforce, because it's their workforce that they require. They will need to contribute to this as well. Now, work won't be right for all, and I think we ought to acknowledge that as we begin today's debate. But too many people are being written off from even trying a job. So one of the things I am looking for at the budget, and indeed I would hope this is going to come in a white paper from the Department for Work and Pensions, is to reform benefits to separate eligibility for money from what work a claimant could do with the right help, and also reduce assessments. Instead, we should be helping people to try work where they can and where they wish to, so their talent isn't wasted. And I would also argue for some small policies that can go with this, for example, a disability employment fund. We need a range of solutions, and I'm sure we'll get into that in today's debate, because people's motivations and incentives vary. But the imperative here is absolutely urgent. It will contribute to the very important goals of growing the economy, halving inflation, because continued labour shortages block growth and bring inflation. It's morally right to be cutting the NHS backlogs anyway, but we should also be doing so with this urgent need in mind, essentially to get British people and the British economy back on their feet together. Now, there are some estimates of what you get on GDP if you do this. There's one estimate that suggests you might be able to boost GDP by £30 billion a year if you properly addressed this problem. And the REC suggests that's the size of the entire defence budget, so that it's worth looking at. But we should be aiming high. I also have my eye on what some other countries are doing in respect to this. I think there is some interesting work coming from Sweden, where 15% more people aged 55 to 64 are in work than here. I think Japan will have some essential lessons with its ageing society. On ill health and disability, I think there are interesting moves going on in Australia. And I think Canada blazes a trail with its Accessible Canada Act in terms of a clear vision of a country with no disabling barriers by 2040. The key point from me then, Carl, this morning is that everybody's talents have to be included in growing our economy, and everybody needs the chance to grow. Government can only do so much. Business must invest both in skills but also in health to get the workforce that they need. Together, government and business can bridge this gap. Without action, including at next week's budget, that gap will get even bigger, and it would be an appalling human tragedy if it did.
Thank you, Chloe. Some fascinating points there, and hopefully we can return to those in the discussion. Julian.
Yes, thank you. Well, two quick points from me. The first we actually touched on before the session started, which is the importance of good and probably better data to analyse exactly what's going on. So we have these big headline numbers that there are something like 9 million economically inactive people of working age, and that's an increase of roughly 500,000 over the last few years. But we can only sort of make a stab at what the precise causes of that are. It does look like the biggest single contributing factor has been a jump in the number of people who are long-term sick or disabled. That number seems to account for almost all of the increase over the last few years. If that is the case, of course, that requires much different interventions than if the problem were somewhere else, if it were in the pension system, for example, or the tax system. So first point, absolutely essential to understand what the problem is before you can come up with a solution. The second point I want to emphasize is that we should be looking for market solutions as far as possible. And in particular, we should avoid the sort of clumsy state interventions that sometimes actually make problems worse. My starting point, therefore, would be, what the incentives are. Are there problems in the incentives for people to work? Are there problems in the tax and benefit system? And also pay. There's a lot of a narrative, particularly coming from the Bank of England and others at the moment, that we need to avoid a wage price spiral. But it may well be that paying people more is actually the best way to encourage them back into work. We shouldn't necessarily resist that. We also, of course, need to look at potential barriers to employment, and it does seem like ill health is a particular problem at the moment. And if we are determined to press ahead with the state having an effective monopoly on public healthcare, then I think we need to look at the NHS and try and reform that and make it support people better. In the case of other interventions, I always think it's important to ask what the market failure is that justifies the state getting involved. And I think a good example here is the proposals coming out now for some sort of state subsidy for employers to have occupational healthcare schemes, which sort of begs the question, why aren't employers doing that themselves already if it clearly benefits their firm? I think there is an answer to that. There may be some wider public good, some sort of externalities argument that would justify state subsidy, but we need to be clear why the state needs to get involved in decisions that clearly mainly benefit private companies. Other interventions where I'm also nervous, there was a big push in the early stages of the pandemic to get younger people back into work as soon as possible, which at face value sounds great, but if all it's doing is encouraging employers to take on a 21-year-old rather than 25-year-old, it's just shuffling the problem around. So my second key theme is, state intervention may be appropriate in some circumstances, but let's be clear what the market failure is that we're trying to correct and how state intervention can help rather than hinder.
Thank you, Julian. I think there's definitely a few things we're going to need to return to there as the discussion evolves. Henry.
Thanks, Carl, and thanks for having me today. So I don't want to be too much of a party pooper, but I'm going to introduce a bit of skepticism about the potential for Britain to get big economic returns from increasing participation, or at least getting back the participation that was lost during the pandemic. So as Carl said at the beginning, there are about 500,000 more economically inactive people in the UK than there were in 2019. But more than half of that, about 60%, according to the ONS analysis, can be pretty straightforwardly explained by changes in the structure of the population. So we have more people in the young and old segments of the population, even the working age population, which tend to have lower participation rates rather than in the prime age years of their career. We have more of those people at the extremes than we did in 2019. That explains about 60% of the shortfall. So you're looking about 200,000 people lost during the pandemic, a lot to ill health if the surveys are to be believed. And that's about 0.5% of the UK workforce, which is obviously worth having, but in the context of long run trends in participation, it's not massive. And we went through a decade in the 2010s where the participation trends were pretty strong, the employment trends were pretty strong. It was celebrated by the Conservative government at the time as a jobs miracle. And if we look at the overall 16 to 64 activity rate in the UK, it's just a little below 80%, which is roughly where it was in 2017, when, as I say, the government was celebrating its successes in getting people into work. Now, you may not want to rest on your laurels, but I think it's worth putting that in context. I also went and looked back at the OBR forecast from 5 years ago, from spring 2018, and the participation rate that was forecast for today was actually a shade lower than what we have. If you focus on just the prime age workers, those who are 25 to 54, their employment rates are very close to an all-time high. They're beating everything in the 2010s with the exception of the final 3 quarters of 2019. So before the pandemic, we were at this really high watermark, and we've come off it a little bit, and that's bad. But we've had really good long-term trends on unemployment and participation, which probably make it hard to eke out additional incremental gains. Now, it's true that the performance is worse than other countries, and it's true that we have companies reporting labour shortages, but of course, everywhere, even countries that look better on the participation trends, are reporting labour shortages at the moment because economies have been stimulated too much. Employment in general is very high. Economies are hot. Labour markets are running tight. So those reports of labour shortages from businesses aren't a UK specific phenomenon, in my view. It's just that that slight tick down. So I would put any discussion of the workers lost during the pandemic in the context of those longer run trends in the 2010s. I think that it's quite unlikely that the government's going to be able to come up with participation policies which are going to materially move the growth forecast, and I'd be quite surprised if you get that from the OBR at the budget next week. That's not to say I don't think it's worth doing everything you can to get more participation. That should be something that you're always doing. The UK is okay for participation in international comparisons. It's not at the top. It's behind, in particular, some of the Nordic countries, and it's ahead mainly because America's performance on participation is so bad. But I would be cautious about this idea that there's this big, certainly easy win to be had getting workers back from the pandemic, because I actually think that's quite unlikely.
Thank you, Henry. That's a really helpful sort of contextualization and perspective on it. I think actually there's one thing there in particular I want to return to in a minute, maybe to be skeptical about partial skepticism. But firstly, Jonathan, can we hear from you, please?
Thank you, Carl, and thank you to everyone else who's with their opening remarks. It's very interesting. I think the long run trends that Henry talks about are interesting and important, because I think that going forward, it's not clear what is going to kind of have the upper hand. Are we going to return to this long trend of higher participation, coming from greater education, greater women's labour force attachment in, for want of a word, kind of, earlier in life, in people's 30s and 40s, that's kind of coming through into their 50s, higher pension ages that have happened and are going to happen. So are those kind of long run trends going to reassert themselves, or are we, facing a higher, facing the worst rates of disability, poorer health on a number of metrics? Is that going to kind of be the primary driver going forward of poorer labour force participation, particularly among older people? I do think that's an open question, but I think that we need to keep that in mind, that future is really, as always, very uncertain. The second thing, I want to go back to Julian's point on incentives, of course, as an economist, but I think about not only the incentives to work, but the incentives to work more hours. Now, people working more hours doesn't solve your participation problem, but it does solve, to some extent, capacity problems, labour shortages to some extent. And we have historically, I say we, the United Kingdom, historically focused on getting people into some form of work, getting people into part-time work, and not so much focus on incentivizing part-time workers to expand their numbers of hours to full-time, which, not only has the potential to, increase their pay directly because they work more, but the potential, it really opens up the potential to kind of gain more skills, gain more experience more quickly, and the returns to full-time work being very important. So I would like us not to forget the hours dimension as well as the participation dimension on this.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. And I think it would be interesting to hear from other panelists on sort of your point and Henry's point about whether we're going to see the long-term trend reassert itself, or whether we are in a situation now where the changes in the labour market since the pandemic are going to not just be a blip. So I don't know if Julian or Chloe, you might want to weigh in on that point.
Well, just to come in, first of all, that was partly a reference to a pretty good ONS study, I think, that came out last week that had some great charts if you want to look on the ONS website. And it is the case that we have seen a sort of pick up in the two particular age groups, the relatively young and the relatively old who are still of working age. And that's where the increase in economic activity seems to be particularly marked. So there's clearly some sort of underlying demographic trend there. I think, though, well, 2 points. Well, that just sort of underlines the importance of getting this right, because certainly there's going to be a long-term trend, obviously, towards an aging population in particular. And that's going to create all sorts of problems, not just for the labour market, but also the funding of services for people in retirement, more healthcare, social care, pensions, and so on. So this is probably one of the biggest single policy challenges facing any government over the coming decades. But also, yes, I mean, normal demographics, of course, are hard to fight. But I think this is such an important problem that we do need to fight this. We do need to look for ways to make sure that the normal pattern is for people to work longer rather than to retire early, to take advantage of the fact that most people are actually in better health than they used to be in their 50s and 60s, and far more able to work than they would otherwise have been. So it's a challenge, but I think this is a trend that we can do a little bit about, at least at the margin that could still make a big difference.
Carl, I'll add a point as well. I think there's another aspect of long-term trends that is relevant and interesting in this discussion. And it's what has happened in terms of disability benefits. So the payments that we make to support people, and as at present, as listeners will know, there's two. We're talking about ESA and PIP. One is income related, one is functional related. But the key point that I think comes in here about long-term trends is that since the 1970s, when effectively this particular data set begins, the claimant rate has, on the disability side has actually just gone up, only in one direction. There is not differentiation in that line, as opposed to if you looked at a graph of what unemployment benefit, traditionally named, does over time, and that moves in accordance with economic shifts. Now, I would draw two questions from that. One is, and the point I think was just made there by Julian, we are seeing huge advances, obviously, in our healthcare and in our healthiness overall. And as a modern developed nation, do we accept that actually we've got sicker since the 1970s? I'm not sure that would be the case, and I'm not sure people would generally accept that. And indeed, actually, historically, John Major posed this question. He said, well, can the nation have got sicker? And he concluded, no, they couldn't. So he did some other reforms in the history of this. That's question one for debate. Question two for debate then is, are we correct at this stage of proceedings to make a distinction between unemployment benefit and disability or ill health benefits? Could we actually take a radical approach here and say, this analysis of economic inactivity shows us that there are lots of people who may have poor health or a disability, but still wish to work. So it may be an artificial distinction to say there's two types of benefits for two types of scenarios. I did, of course, at the outset acknowledge that work isn't right for everybody, and I would say that again here. But I think we could probe that question actually in terms of what we want our welfare state to look like for the future.
Absolutely. I wonder if building on that, so there's clearly some interesting distinctions and questions within the benefit system. Perhaps also there are things we could look at in terms of pension rules as well. So things I'm looking at might be, for example, the lifetime allowance. I don't know if Jonathan, maybe you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you could think about changing some of these rules around the margin. Lifetime allowance has gone down a lot. I certain, there have been proposals to make kind of it harder to draw your pension, for example, as a result of these changes. And I would be pretty anti that, because I think that one of the key things in pensions is the ability to have stability and to plan and to know what you're going to be able to do or not able to do. And so, you do hear things like, let's put the minimum age you can get a defined contribution pension up to 60 or something like that. I think that would be an extremely stupid thing to do, frankly, and very unfair when people are, in terms of encouraging people to save for their pensions. What you don't want to do is people to get near when they can get their pensions and suddenly get out. And maybe there's a case for putting the lifetime allowance up a bit. I'm generally relatively skeptical you're going to get much purchase on for right now from that kind of move, though.
So do you think there's a difference between changes you can make to get people back into the workforce, which actually there might not be many people who would be enticed back by things like that, versus stopping this becoming a more long-term structural trend?
Oh, I would certainly worry much more about that latter. I think there is some fairly good evidence, at least some of the increase in economic inactivity. One came from a spike in unemployment, redundancies in 2020 that people then just didn't go back to work from. That's a small but not totally insignificant number of people. I doubt you're going to get many of those people back. And some people, I think my broad understanding is it's likely that they experienced something during the pandemic, whether it's their experience of furlough or the world of work changing or whatever, that meant that they just preferred the ability to retire now compared to continuing on with work. Again, I think you're relatively unlikely to get those people back as well. So to the extent that you're worrying about it, I do think the kind of keeping people in the labour market is a bigger issue, or should be the focus, rather than necessarily working out exactly who left, for what reasons, and how to get them back.
It's interesting. There was a study by, I think, polling by Public First towards the end of last year, and they were comparing attitudes towards work amongst British workers versus German workers and American workers. And it seems that the attitude here is much more negative. So I was wondering if any of the panelists have got any idea on what employers could do to change those attitudes. Is there anything government could do? I mean, what is the solution there? Is it just pay, or is there more that should be done?
Well, just to say, I think it's a combination of things. There's no sort of one size fits all solution to this. I mean, clearly, because labour is now in short supply for one reason or another, employers have an enormous incentive to adapt and to be flexible. We've seen that, of course, during the pandemic. A lot more people are able to work from home or have hybrid roles that might be more attractive to people who otherwise might face the alternative, the dreaded 5-day-a-week boring commute and all that sort of thing. And more flexibility, I think, is particularly important for older workers who do have more choices in life, particularly if they have got a bit of a retirement income behind them and wealth tied up in their home and all that sort of thing. They probably do need a bit more of an incentive to continue working. That said, that I think there has been some evidence, at least anecdotal evidence recently, that some of the people who retired in the wake of the pandemic are actually starting to come back to work again because they miss it. Particularly some older people who miss the engagement of work and all the sort of the softer benefits that brings. And I'm extremely wary of anecdotal evidence when it's personal, but my own mother, who I'm sure she'll forgive me for saying that she's in the group of over 64 years old. I mean, she's now working pretty well on a research project with the university, and she's contributing massively in what she does, but also benefiting from it enormously. So it's interesting. A lot of what we've talked about today is about a working age which is defined as somewhere between 16 and 64. But I see no reason why lots of people in their 70s can't work and benefit from it, not just in the usual way financially, but also in terms of the continued engagement with society and everything else that comes with that.
I'd like to come in on this as well, Carl, and I think there's a small point I'm just going to pick up first, actually, from Julian. Then I want to respond to Jonathan's question that he implicitly posed. I think in our terms of debate here, we ought to be careful about talking essentially only in terms of white collar flexibility. So the idea of those who commute to work and may have the luxury of choosing whether they do which day of the week they do if the trains are running. That's one thing, but we ought to, I think, be really clear here that there's, of course, a great deal of people who are just not in that category, and actually, many of these workforce questions will be essentially in terms of blue collar needs, and I say needs both from the employer's perspective. There will be, many who are, to pick an example, in a manufacturing sector, wanting to recruit workers, and there will equally be many people for whom that was their trade or that was their background, and they want to be in that kind of work. So let's perhaps broaden ourselves to remember that. Just coming back in then on this point about retention, which was Jonathan's point, and I think this is absolutely essential, and it's essential actually from the human perspective. A person's experience is radically different once they fall out of work and are then trying to get back into work. And we see this, we have actually stacks of evidence on this from inside the support systems in my former department. But it's also, I think, anecdotally true, and probably many listeners will be able to sympathise with this point. Retention, therefore, is arguably even more important than recruitment in this debate. And I think that's particularly true when we're talking about the health and disability side. We really, really need to be able to focus on helping a person to weather some changes, that if it's a case of changes in their life, or to expect and get the correct adaptations and support that would help them, and that is their right by law. So then my third point in this section is what can employers do? So your question, Carl. And I'll just go really practical here. There is by now actually a really great body of information available to employers about what to do about all of this. So in particular, you've got toolkits from the likes of the CPI, excuse me, CBI. You've also got great help through the FSB and similar. The Health and Safety Executive indeed has ventured into this field and again has a supportive toolkit for employers. And also there's a government source as well. Now, all of those are designed to help employers get over these bumps and actually just use some basic tools to be able to retain and then also, if needed, recruit, but with a view to what might you need to do to be more supportive in this world that we are discussing.
Henry, did I see you were going to come in on this point?
Yes, I was going to answer one of your earlier points about British firms, and it just occurred to me that we know from the work of economists Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen that the standards of British management generally in the private sector are not as high as they could be. And though it's been suggested in that work that's connected to Britain's productivity problem, of course, these issues are linked, not just because productivity determines your pay, but also because if it is the case that British workers have an unusually negative attitude towards work and their managers are unusually bad, then I would have thought it's possible those things are connected as well. Now, it's not something that's in the gift of government to fix, but it is a structural problem with the British economy that the quality of management could be higher. And the other thing that springs to mind in terms of why Britain might stand out in attitudes to work is I think I'm right in saying that Britain has long commutes, and that's connected to the long-standing failure of planning policy in the country. And on both these points, I would say it's a reminder that I think to the extent government's trying to influence choices here, it should be by making the economy work better such that people freely choose to work. If people want to retire because they have a bad manager, low pay and a long commute, I'm a bit hesitant about saying, well, that's a bad thing, and therefore we need to change the pension rules to encourage them back into work. We need to, certainly if it's something that would make pensions and harder to access, then I'm not really sure the government should start from the position of having a workforce participation target saying, 85% is right and 80% is wrong. Rather, I think it should be focused on these underlying problems. And then in each case, the procedural fairness involved. I mean, the lifetime allowance, for instance, I think should be set on the basis of what we think a reasonable limit is on the tax advantages of pensions, and not fiddled with just because the government's woken up one morning and decided it would like to get participation up a little bit.
So part of what you're saying there is build more houses, basically. Sure.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of good that will come of that, but I would have thought that reduced commute times would make work more
very interesting point.
more appealing. Yeah.
Can I just come in one sec on the bad, the poorer management side is that, with the aging population and kind of labour shortage, you would think that firms will have incentives to make the give the flexibilities, white collar, blue collar workers or whatever. And I think we can be kind of optimistic about some change there. I think the difficulty is that, not combined with both potentially some bad management practices and the fact that very few, and again, I'm going to focus on the older workers because that's where the lower participations come in. Very few people change employer, change occupation, beyond the age of 50, 55. It's, the labour market is quite rigid there. People who get made unemployed after the age of 55, the re-entry rates plummet. And so I think the problem there is, even if you do get some maybe enlightened managers, well-trained managers who respond to the incentives of and the demands of a potentially older workforce, the extent you have a poorer set of managers who don't, that is going to affect a sizable group of people, because it's quite hard to move between firms, between places, between occupations at these ages, and those rigidities don't help.
Carl, may I throw another point in here, just as we're talking, I suppose, about the infrastructure that goes around work? I do think it's worth bringing childcare into the debate under that heading, because it is a constraint. It's it's observably not working in its market, and I speak as a parent of small kids myself. The truth is, this does need to be looked at. There are certainly various government reforms that would help. I mean, again, to avoid a stereotype occurring in this debate, this is not a female workers issue. This is a family issue. There will nowadays in the 21st century be every bit as many of younger dads out there who are wanting, needing this solution. And it also then goes to the point that was made earlier in the debate about part-time and full-time, which I think is a really good point, and does need to be thought about here. There is again, referring back to the design of the welfare system, actually there is what some might say is surprisingly low thresholds in there. Essentially there has been an expectation that if you work 9 hours on universal credit, then you're working. Now, actually 9's not a great deal. And even around, for example, a school schedule, if you were doing school drop-offs and pickups, 9 is actually still, as it were, only, let's say, 2 of those days in the week. So we do need to address the part-time, full-time question in this debate, and I do think we also need to think about childcare.
Right, I think one final question from me, and then we'll open the floor to our audience. And my question is about young people. So much of the conversation is understandably focused on people aged 50 to 64. As I think a few of you have mentioned, there is some elevated inactivity at the other end of the spectrum. And part of this is students, of course, so in the time series. But interestingly, inactivity has gone down over the last few months because of more people who were students now looking for work and leaving the time series. But at the same time, the number of people not in education, employment and training has gone up by a similar amount, by 65,000. So is there a sort of COVID student generation that we should be paying attention to here, who might be more at risk of longer term economic or drifting into inactivity? And could we be storing up problems for ourselves in the long run if we don't, pay attention to what's going on at the other end now?
Yeah, I think that has to be right. I think, first of all, in terms of the bigger picture, I think it is probably right to worry less about young people being temporarily inactive over the last few years than older people, because a lot of it, as you say, could be explained either by them going into education and staying there for longer than they might otherwise have done. And also because a lot of the sectors that were particularly hit hard during COVID were those where disproportionate number of young people tended to be employed. So a lot of customer facing business, bar work, all those sorts of things. So I think a lot of those people will naturally come back. And as I said earlier, I'm wary of targeting particular age groups because of the risk you just shuffle the problem around. But I think there are a few specific issues that are affecting young people more than most at the moment. One seems to be mental health, and this comes up in a lot of the official surveys and the unofficial ones as well. There just seems to be an increase in mental health problems amongst the young, which may partly be related to the disruption to their education and their lives more generally during the COVID pandemic. So if I were prioritising a healthcare intervention for young people, it would be more investment in healthcare, better understanding what the problems are there in the mental health field.
Okay, would anyone else like to weigh in on this point?
Just a quick thing, if it's okay. I mean, I do think that I agree. More student numbers that nobody really worries that much about a higher inactivity from that. That being said, I think the fact that this generation had such a disruptive education, at a crucial time of moving from work to potentially training or into adulthood, combined with the fact that, for example, university education was disrupted, but you could still kind of apply and go. People seeking apprenticeships, things in skilled trades, careers like that, training opportunities like that. Apprenticeship starts collapsed massively during the pandemic, and there's an extent to which the people looking for a non-university training route into a career really struggled at that point. Now, I don't know the extent to which those are the bounce back, but I'm sure they haven't kind of doubled given that they kind of almost disappeared during the period of the pandemic. And I think that focus potentially on those who didn't maybe do so well formally at school, or wanted a different career option to the kind of university route, might be struggling a bit more. And I probably would, I think we should be probably more people should be digging into that.
So similar to what Chloe was saying earlier, that we shouldn't overlook sort of the blue collar workers in this. It's too easy to focus on changes.
Well, particularly at that age, I think, because of all of the things that they experienced and the way that lockdowns affected their training.
Okay, so I think we'll open up some audience questions now. And I'll just remind anyone watching, if you're on Zoom, to drop things in the Q&A box or in the comments on YouTube. And the first question we have up is, what are the best international examples that we can learn from, whether it's dealing with inactivity in the short term or in terms of the longer term trend?
Sure. So I mean, I had a long look at labour force participation in the 2010s when it was rising across the board everywhere. And the slightly uncomfortable thing for governments is, I'd say, no one really understood exactly why it was rising the way it was. So the extent to which you can point at these trends and say the right thing was being done and let's copy it is somewhat limited. Across the rich world as a whole, the big gain in participation, particularly in the late 2010s, was coming from women. And I don't know if it's the case that policies with respect to childcare were improving on the whole internationally. But I agree that the organisation of childcare is very important for working families. So I think Chloe was right to raise that as potentially an issue. When you look at the international comparisons of the level of labour force participation, as I think I said in my opening remarks, we're better than the US, better than Italy. We're a bit behind, I think, now Japan, who had a real run up in female labour force participation in the 2010s. But we stand out for being behind some of the Nordic countries. And if you had to look at one thing that they were doing, I think the natural thing would be the family policy. Although there are lots of different available models there.
Interesting stuff. So family policy, a sort of key focus you'd like to see, well, that we could possibly look at. And I think we probably all agree that regardless of that, childcare is something that needs fixing in this country anyway.
I think you can confidently say that the status quo on childcare is broken. It's not to say I think that the solution is for the government to come in with enormous subsidies, because let's not forget Britain already expanded its childcare subsidies significantly, but something in terms of support for parents, or at least fixing what's clearly a market which is not working well, I think is important.
Okay, we have another question here, and this is actually something we were discussing earlier about data and data management and the problems of getting to the bottom of what's going on. And this might be a little bit technical, but how should the government be handling data better in the welfare system, and perhaps connecting that up to tax or other areas, so that we can in future get a better understanding of what's going on in the labour markets?
I don't know if anyone wants to come in. Chloe, do you look like you were about to? But
I'm happy to come in second if you, or maybe Julian wants to take the point first. Then I'll
okay. I mean, a couple of things. One, I think it's still surprising how hard it is for government how hard it is for bits of government to talk to each other. You know, as somebody who uses government data, you know, the idiosyncrasies of different departments and the extent to which they talk to each other is baffling and remains baffling. I think that actually kind of what the state knows about people, and sorry, that sounds kind of big brotherish, but it's been highlighted by some of the challenges that we've had in recent years about targeting COVID support, about targeting energy support, that we use, you know, slightly strange ways of getting, you know, emergency money to people through things like council tax, through things like energy bills. It's quite easy to do it through, you know, the set of people on universal credit, maybe the state pension, or, you know, winter fuel payment, but it's actually very difficult to know, you know, who is where, who's in what households, you know, how many people are there, and how much income do they have. We don't know about lots of those things, at least as government, which makes it hard to target policies. Now, I can see that there are trade-offs and some issues around that people might not like government knowing these things, but there is a trade-off in terms of the flexibility of policy options that government has there.
I think that analysis is right, Jonathan. That there are some basic problems here, and quite foundational ones. You're correct to have observed that about the emergency payment options. I also think there's a key point here, which is about who has ownership of the labour market as on the government side. Now, you know, through my remarks earlier on and everybody else throughout the debate, I think we've been able to be really clear about why this matters. In other words, what the imperatives are. You know, why would you want to address these issues? And just to recap, I mean, I think there's a really clear point from businesses' perspective, so they need to own some of this problem. There's a really clear point, nonetheless, from the wider economy perspective. So, you know, rightly, the Chancellor takes the overall interest in that. And then, absolutely, there's a set of kind of what you would call social imperatives sitting underneath that about the welfare and life of individuals. That all of that said, there isn't or hasn't been to date a single place in government where there is clear ownership and grip and energetic addressing of the labour market. I mentioned at the outset, you know, I certainly took that to be my role when I was Secretary of State for work and pensions last year. And I hope that comes again. I really do, because I think there needs to be all those things. I think there needs to be that level of enthusiasm and grip on this. And I'm absolutely sure that Jeremy and also Mel, of course, will be able to, do that following the budget steps. But that's what's needed, because this is too big. This is too big and too important not to get that kind of treatment inside government.
Okay. Thank you for that, Chloe. So another question just had through from the audience, and this is a sort of broader labour market point, which follows on quite nicely. How did the panel assess the sort of long-term outlook for the labour market, given trends in automation, AI, and technology?
I'll have a first stab at this. I think 2 points. First of all, I see the developments in AI and ChatGPT and all that sort of thing as essentially positive. The concern with all these developments is always that where the job's going to be if people are replaced by machines. But all the evidence over decades and indeed centuries is that the effective integration of technology into the labour market, into the workplace, into society more generally can actually augment labour rather than replace it. It means we don't have to do some of the tedious things that we used to have to do, and those of us lucky enough to have the more sophisticated jobs can actually, if anything, probably do them even better than otherwise. So I would view that as a positive. But in order for that to be a positive, it's essential that we maintain as much flexibility as possible to make it easier for people to move from one type of job to another, or for companies to integrate the new technology into their workplace. So in order for that to be a positive, you need to maintain flexibility in labour markets, and I think that's an essential part of this story as well. I do, for example, get very worried when people say that we need to clamp down on things like 0 hours contracts on the basis of a few hard cases, when in fact 0 hours contracts seem to be particularly beneficial to, for example, young people, students who need to top up their incomes, but also to older people for whom the option of doing a bit of work to top up their income in retirement is really attractive, and a 0 hours contract might be perfect for them. So I think with all of this, trust in ingenuity and flexibility of markets to adjust and make sure that any interventions that you do from the state don't in some way have unintended consequences that make things worse.
Yeah, I think many of us would be inclined to agree with that perspective on it. Henry, did I see you were going to come in on this?
Yes, I mean, I don't really differ from that view. There have been lots of automation concerns voiced for years on end, all while this long-term employment miracle, if you like, that I was talking about at the start, kept going. And you can't see in the data evidence for these sorts of concerns coming to bear. There's always creative destruction going on. Jobs are always being changed by new technologies. I do think that AI chatbots and AI more broadly is likely to be more transformative than more mundane technological advances. So I do think that the world of work is going to change a lot for white-collar professionals on the basis of these tools, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have lots of people thrown out of work as a result of it. It just means you need to work out how to harness that technology and to use it productively. What we might see is increasing bifurcation in the labour market, which is a very long-running trend, the hollowing out of the middle. People are quite pessimistic on this, saying it's a bad thing. In fact, the economies over time, this is true with respect to America, I suspect it's true with respect to Britain, has been creating more better jobs than worse jobs as it's replaced those jobs in the middle. But it wouldn't surprise me if AI led to a bit more of that sort of thing going on. But on the whole, it's not a reason to be pessimistic about employment.
May I just add one point on this? And I was recently re-inspired by the old Peter Drucker quote that the best way to predict the future is to be part of creating it. And I think there really is an important point in today's debate about practicality, right? What we're going to see at the budget next week, or as a result of these conversations, even in the think tank here today, is not going to be some kind of beautiful, pristine master plan. There isn't going to be one of those. What there is a series of imperatives where people have incentives to act. I would argue that lead amongst those is businesses needing to fill vacancies. So, let's include that sort of practical call to action from today's debate, that you need to be part of these decisions, and they're your decisions to make if you're listening to this as an employer. Delighted if our conversation has helped flesh some of the points out, but fundamentally this is here for the making.
A very optimistic note. Absolutely. Okay, so I think we've got time for one final question, and this, I suppose, relates to the potential for inactivity among young people. So it's, do we need to do more to position the degree apprenticeship as equal or even better than the traditional 3-year undergraduate route?
Can I come in on that? A strong yes to that. I mean, as it happens, I was at a careers evening at my daughter's school last night, and this was flagged up as an option, which was I was really pleased to see. I'm a little bit old-fashioned on this. My gut feeling is that actually too many people now potentially go to university and spend 3 years doing a subject that is not particularly relevant or not particularly well taught. Whereas if they had some sort of degree apprenticeship scheme, some more sort of hands-on experience, particularly some sort of continual engagement with an employer, that might be a much better sort of hybrid route for them into the labour market. So I'm all in favour of flexibility and people having as many different options as possible. And certainly the degree apprenticeship scheme is I think a very good idea. I'm pleased, by the way, that it seems to be quite widely adopted within the civil service as well as in the private sector too.
Maybe I touched on apprenticeships earlier, and so I mean I'm pretty positive about this as well, except for the numbers of them are still very small compared to some of the lower level apprenticeships. My understanding is there's pretty good evidence of fairly good returns to higher level level 3, level 4 apprenticeships, and that there has been a kind of change in what apprenticeships are towards higher skill, higher quality courses, for want of a better word, or training, and that is good. But the numbers of them are it is like a pond compared to an ocean in terms of number of students at the moment, but hopefully the pond can get a bit bigger.
I'll just add my agreement on this point as well, and also from a constituency perspective, I see a lot of people really appreciating degree apprenticeships, both in terms of younger people in Norwich, but also employers locally as well.
Okay, well, I think we're coming to the end of our session. So thank you to all our panelists for these various brilliant insights. I think we've got a lot of food for thought here. Clearly, we have to think about the longer term context in which we're discussing what might just be a short run problem. We have to think about what's going on at both ends of the age spectrum. And we have to think about some of these deep issues that we're already talking about anyway, around childcare, for example, around what do we do about an aging population, and around some of the sort of underlying factors that affect how people feel about their work, whether that's the commutes and therefore planning and housing, whether that's the flexibility, whether that's the offer from the employers. So yeah, let's wait and see what happens in the budget, and thank you to our panelists once again.